So now that the Cold War is finally over, we can focus on things that aren't Russia in terms of our foreign policy. So I've got 4 things here that happen, in global news and affect us in foreign policy under Bush Sr.'s presidency that I want to touch on. The first is the war on drugs. So the war on drugs was actually started back under President Nixon during his administration when he created the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and Bush kept it going, as did every president after Nixon. It kept on with Ford, it kept on with Carter, kept on with Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and Obama. And I'm sure we will still continue to see it happen under President Trump. So essentially under Bush Sr., the strategy was to go after both buyers and sellers, so everyone involved in every level of drug trafficking and selling in the United States. So during his presidency, he was able to see the arrest of one of the leading financiers of the Colombian drug cartel, which was a huge and still has been a major player in terms of getting hard drugs like heroin over the border to the United States. And in December of 1989, he also sent 12,000 troops to invade Panama and arrest the dictator there, who had been charged with bringing drugs into the United States also and funding drug trafficking, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Our next communist threat is going to be China. So now that Russia's we don't have to worry about anymore, China is going to be on our radar. Now, we'd been looking at China for a while since they had their revolution back in the 40s with Chairman Mao Zedong, but they're just starting to become a problem again once we get to the 80s because they're really in the news a lot for human rights violations, censorship. There was no freedom of speech. Even now, they're still having a lot of issues with abuse of journalists and arresting journalists and things like that. So in the late 80s, there was a student-led demonstration in Beijing, the capital, at the university there, against government treatment of civilians and censorship. And it really came to a head on June 4th in 1989 when the Chinese military sent tanks in to kill hundreds of protesters. And that's when this famous photograph was taken, when this one man stood in front of these tanks to block them. Now, we don't know who that man is or what happened to him afterwards. We know that he was taken off the street. He wasn't crushed by the tanks, but after that, the video of the incident goes out. And today, still to this day, the Chinese government censors the internet, including Google, in China. And if you're in China and you Google this picture, it will not come up because the Chinese government doesn't want you to see it. So in response, President Bush will suspend all arms sales to China, but we will remain tied to them very closely economically and democratically. Next is South Africa. So the South African government had been controlled by whites for years and years and years, and they had been practicing a form of segregation called apartheid, which is like segregation in the United States, except for there was even more restrictions on legally, for example, what types of jobs that black South Africans could have, which is why there were no black South Africans in the South African government. So this is what apartheid is. So the leader of the anti-apartheid movement was Nelson Mandela, and he was arrested and put in prison in 1962, basically forever. They were going to keep him in prison forever. So a lot of private companies around the world started pulling their money out of South Africa out of protest, including a lot of American companies. So finally, they put enough pressure on South Africa, trying to cut them off economically from the rest of the world, that they released Nelson Mandela from prison in 1990. So when that happened, he came to the United States and he met with Bush Sr., who endorsed his efforts and said that the rest of the world needs to be behind Nelson Mandela, and that the United States definitely was. So he'll work for another couple of years, and finally in 1994, apartheid will officially come to an end, and Nelson Mandela will be elected the president of South Africa in their first free elections. And lastly, up here, I've got Operation Restore Hope, which took place in Somalia. So there wasn't really a government, and still isn't really a government in Somalia. There are rival warlords who had been fighting for quite some time, resulting in a lot of death and a lot of destruction in this very poor country. And Bush wanted to send troops, but obviously we can't aid one side or the other. Because they're both bad. We just want to help the people who had been cut off from the rest of the world. They weren't able to get food in. They're running out of medical supplies. So we send troops into Somalia as peacekeeping troops to distribute food and supplies to the starving civilians who had been caught in the middle of all of this, which ended up being a really positive thing. So lastly, here is the Persian Gulf War. So I'm sure you've heard of the Persian Gulf War before. It is a very big part of American history and is not that well, it wasn't that long ago. This is actually pretty recent. So this really goes back to 1979 when a new dictator took power in Iraq, and that was Saddam Hussein. So Saddam Hussein took power in Iraq in 1979, and we weren't really paying much attention to him because in 1979 we were having, bigger concerns in Afghanistan with Russia and in Iran with the hostage crisis and other issues. So we just sort of let him lay low, and we were ignoring him until he drew attention to himself when on August 2nd of 1990, he sent about 150,000 Iraqi troops to invade this tiny country down here of Kuwait. Now, Kuwait may be small, but it is very, very wealthy because it's sitting on a very large oil reserve. So what ends up happening is that Saddam is just invading Kuwait to control their oil reserves. So now with Iraq and Kuwait combined, he alone, this crazy dictator, is controlling 20% of the world's oil. This is very bad. It also holds a potential threat because Saudi Arabia is right here. And what if he chooses to go to Saudi Arabia next? Then he'll be controlling something closer to 55-60% of the world's oil supply, which is even worse. So Bush Sr. launches a plan to get the UN forces to back us and demand that Iraqi troops withdraw. So all of this is going to be a UN mission. The UN does vote to get involved here. So in the fall of 1990, the UN will send 700,000 troops to Saudi Arabia. Right down here, you see where all of these dots are, the southern part of Saudi Arabia, where it borders with both Iraq and Kuwait. So they were stationed along that area, and they demanded that Saddam Hussein remove those troops. Now, Bush was hoping that the presence alone of these troops and the threat of them would be enough to scare him out of Kuwait, but at the same time, he was prepared to use them. So of those 700,000 troops in Saudi Arabia, 500,000 of them were American. So the majority of the Persian Gulf War on our side will be fought by American soldiers. And the guy commanding those soldiers will be this man right here, General Colin Powell, who will later be our defense secretary under Bush Jr. So all of this starts, I guess it's been going on, but the most interesting part begins on January 16th of 1991 when General Colin Powell puts into place Operation Desert Storm. And this is when we begin a 5-week aerial assault on Iraqi forces. After those 5 weeks, we begin a 5-day ground war to push the Iraqis back into Iraq. And then finally, the UN will ask for a ceasefire. So all in all, Iraq will lose about 25,000 soldiers in the Persian Gulf War, and the United States will only lose 128. So this was a very great win for us. Now, at that moment, Bush is faced with a couple of different options here. Does he go into Iraq? Do we start a war there to bring down this dictator? Do we let him go? What do we do? And ultimately, Bush decides to stick with the original plan, which was to get into Kuwait, get these Iraqi troops out, and then come home. Mission accomplished. And that's what he does, choosing not to start a war when we didn't necessarily know if we really needed to, which definitely was the right choice at the time. And Bush's approval skyrockets, and people were very, very pleased with this decision. So as for some pop culture events of the 1980s, in 1980, Mount St. Helens erupts in Washington State, killing about 57 people and causing about $1.5 billion worth of property damage. My dad was actually in Oregon at the time, and he said that they shut down the interstate in Oregon because it was covered in like 6 feet of ash, which is insane. He said it looked like it was snowing, but it was just ash falling from the sky, even a whole state away. So you can can see how massive this was. In 1981, Pope John Paul II was shot a couple of times while he was in Vatican City. He did live anyway after going into surgery. And continued to be the Pope for a little while longer. In 1983, the U.S. Embassy was bombed in Beirut in Lebanon as part of just a casualty in the Lebanese civil war that had been going on, and over 80 people were killed in that explosion. In 1984, Los Angeles will host the Summer Olympics. What's interesting is that if you remember, I told you that we boycott the Olympics in 1980 because they were being held in Russia, and Russia is going to boycott the Olympics in 84 because they're being held in the U.S. So it wasn't hard for us to win 174 medals that year, which was the most amount of medals won by anyone that year. In 1986, the U.S. Challenger space shuttle exploded 73 seconds into their launch, and all 7 of the crew were killed immediately. This was an absolute national tragedy. 17% of Americans saw this happen live on TV, which is just really insane to think about. That's millions of people seeing this live on TV, including the families of all of the crew who were on board. Within 30 minutes, over 90% of the United States had heard that this had happened. And news spread much slower, in the 80s than it does today. Obviously, today, if something happened, you would get an alert on your phone immediately, but that wasn't the case back in 1986. So for word about this to spread that quickly, we know how big of a deal this really was. In 1987, Bill Gates became the first microcomputing billionaire, who today is worth closer to $89 billion. Obviously, no one can really spend all of that in a lifetime, so that's why him and his wife Melinda give the majority of their money to different charities. In 1988, as I said, George Herbert Walker Bush will become president of the United States. In 1989, as we see the Berlin Fall, a major moment in world history. And then pop culture, obviously a huge piece of the 1980s. We've got movie franchises like Friday the 13th and Halloween, John Hughes movies, and Star Wars is getting its sequels. For music, we've got MTV, Madonna, Prince, artists like that. This is also the decade where Bob Marley dies, as well as the assassination of John Lennon of the Beatles. Video games are very popular in the 80s. You've got in-home game consoles for the first time, like Nintendo and Atari. Also, arcade games are really popular with things like Pac-Man. For fashion, it's all about, like big hair, high top fades, mullets. We've got shoulder pads and leg warmers. Acid wash is very popular. For television, it's really about sitcom, situational comedy. So TV shows like Family Matters, The Cosby Show, Full House are huge in the 80s. Soap operas are also starting to become popular, as are late night talk shows. And then for sports, this is really the era of Michael Jordan. He's at the peak of his career here when he's playing for the Chicago Bulls. This is when we're seeing the rivalry between Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. We've got football players like Joe Montana making headway in their career. Obviously, the Olympics are a huge part of the 1980s sports history. We've got the Miracle on Ice, which takes place in 1980 when the U.S. hockey team beats the Russians, which made us feel like we had won the whole Cold War in one night. And then we also host the Olympics in 1984. We've also got, let me think, what else for sports? I don't know. I can't think of any. Oh, WrestleMania comes out in the 1980s. So back when professional wrestling was actually wrestling, people like Hulk Hogan were getting really famous. So a bunch of different things happening here in the 80s, and it is a lot of really interesting history.